In the world of music, Hoodie Ledbetter, otherwise known as Leadbelly, is a well-known icon whose innovative style changed the way that certain artists play the blues and folk music. By the time he died, he was known as the king of the 12-string guitar, which was a nickname he actually gave to himself at the beginning, but by the time his career was over, everybody was calling him that. He not only left behind a vast discography of compelling music, but his life story is arguably more interesting than his musical endeavors. From prison breaks to murder to a treasure trove of compelling art, this man's life truly had it all, and that's what we're going to be having a look at today. This is the insane life of Leadbelly. It's hard to tell when Leadbelly was actually born because there is discrepancies between the recorded census and the information provided by people close to him, but the most popular answer is January 20th, 1888. Either way, it was the late 1800s, and his parents, Sally Brown and Wesley Leadbetter, raised him in Mooringsport, Louisiana. According to the Blues Encyclopedia, Leadbelly had an okay upbringing but still dropped out of school at 12 years old. At this point, his family was in Texas, and soon after this, he was living next to his parents in Bowie County with his wife, Aletha Henderson. At this stage, Hoodie had already been introduced to music through his uncle Terrell, who at first gave him an accordion but later was credited with also introducing him to the guitar and teaching him the basics. However, the renowned ability he would later achieve did not come from his uncle, but instead came from a sort of cocktail of musically defining moments. The timeline here is a little messy and there are some holes in what really happened, but regardless of how patchy the story is, the result was the same. So to start off, in his early career, Leadbelly often performed at a place called St. Paul's Bottoms, which was a notorious red light district in Louisiana that introduced Leadbelly to saloons, brothels, and dance halls, playing an array of different music that would help Leadbelly have an open mind when it came to his sound. Secondly, Leadbelly started playing with an artist known as Blind Lemon Jefferson in Texas, who helped him improve his skill set on the guitar. Jefferson was an intricate player who didn't follow the conventional norms of blues, and it's entirely possible that his unique style rubbed off on Leadbelly when they played together. Finally, and most importantly, at some point in the early 1900s, Leadbelly began to use a 12-string guitar instead of the traditional 6-string guitar. This allegedly came from Leadbelly witnessing a Mexican musician using the instrument, and since then, it became his forte. This would become a staple of Leadbelly's music. The area he played in, the teacher he had, and the 12-string guitar he used were all formative parts of Leadbelly's earlier musical endeavors, and it's clear that he was not only becoming a well-rounded, unique musician, but that he was ready to take it seriously. So much so that in his early 20s, he left his home and his family. He had at least 2 children at this stage and was still married to Aletha Henderson, but even with all of that, he only seemed to truly care about traveling around America with his music. In the early 1910s, he lined the railroad tracks, picked cotton, and played his music to whoever would listen around the southwest of America. This lifestyle seemed to have been working. He was described as a very hard worker and his music was clearly getting better, so Leadbelly seemed to be heading in the right direction, but in the mid-1910s, something pretty bizarre happened that changed the course of Leadbelly's life. In 1915, Leadbelly was arrested for possessing a pistol and assault in Texas and was subsequently sent to work with the Harrison County chain gang for 30 days. This did not last long, however, because after only a couple of days with the chain gang, he escaped from custody, allegedly outrunning the officers' dogs in the process. After this, he stayed in Texas and used a fake name, Walter Boyd, which he used to find work in Bowie County. This pseudonym lasted for a few years, but in December of 1917, he found himself in some serious trouble when he shot and killed one of his relatives, Will Stafford, over a woman. It looked like Leadbelly would be spending the rest of his life in prison, or at the very least he wouldn't be getting out for a few decades. However, he figured out a system that seemed to work in his favor. He would sing to the prisoners and the guards, and he also generally stayed under the radar and didn't violate any of the prison's rules. He did find himself in a pretty serious situation when another prisoner stabbed him in the neck. He almost killed the assailant in retaliation, but both he and the attacker survived. This attack left him with a nasty scar on his neck that he would cover up with the bandana. In later years, this actually became a staple of his aesthetic, and the incident in question added to his already dangerous image. But his image in prison was fairly clean, and he used this to his advantage when he asked for his freedom by writing a song to Pat Morris Neff, the governor of Texas at the time. Neff had strong principles and had actually stated that he had no intention to issue any pardons when he came into power, but Leadbelly seemed to be the exception. Between the song, his good behavior, and the fact that he had served 7 years of his sentence, which was the minimum amount at the time, Governor Neff decided to issue the pardon in 1925, and Leadbelly was a free man. This freedom lasted around 5 years, and in this time, Leadbelly essentially continued what he was already doing before, picking up odd jobs that he could get and playing his music in his free time. However, if you haven't figured it out by now, Leadbelly had a pretty abrasive personality and quite the temper. He was also an alcoholic, and this would lead him down a dangerous road that unfortunately ended up with him being back in prison in 1930. This time it was for attempted murder after he got into another fight. His temper and alcoholism had yet again led him to prison, and it wasn't looking like Leadbelly was headed down a road that would lead anywhere, but fortunately for him, he met somebody while he was in prison that would change his life forever. The early 1930s saw the peak of the Great Depression in the United States. Unemployment was ridiculously high, and around 20% of all Americans were unemployed. People were losing their jobs left, right, and center, and one man who lost almost everything was John Lomax. Not only did he lose his job at the bank that he worked at, but his wife also passed away around the same time. Lomax went into a deep depression but was pulled out of it by his oldest son, Alan Lomax, who recommended that they tour America and search for folk songs, something that John Lomax used to do as a job. Their goal was to make an anthology of music that they found, and they would go from town to town searching for underground artists, specifically African American folk musicians who wouldn't normally be given a platform. You can probably guess where this story is going. One day while they were visiting a prison in Louisiana, they came across Leadbelly and were instantly impressed. Later, they returned to the prison with some recording equipment and recorded hundreds of his songs. This was most likely the first time he had ever been recorded somewhat properly, which was baffling considering how talented he was and the fact that he was now in his 40s. Lomax was so impressed by him that he took a petition and a Leadbelly recording to the Louisiana governor, Oscar K. Allen, requesting that Leadbelly be released. Soon after this request was made, Leadbelly actually was released, but the governor and the prison claimed that this was simply because of good behavior and because of budget cuts. However, Leadbelly hadn't even served his minimum sentence yet, and both him and Lomax believed that the recording they had sent the governor had worked, and they were covering their tracks because this was the second time that Leadbelly had successfully sung his way out of jail. Regardless of the reason, Leadbelly was yet again a free man. He was out of prison, but everything was far from perfect. It was the middle of the Great Depression and he was just released from prison. It's safe to say that nobody was going to hire Leadbelly, and because of this, he asked John Lomax for some kind of job. Lomax took him on as his driver, and for 3 months, they traveled around the states together searching for folk music. This helped Leadbelly learn even more about the world of music, and being with somebody as knowledgeable as John Lomax was definitely beneficial to Leadbelly's music. In December of 1934, Leadbelly participated in a group sing at a college where Lomax was doing a lecture. There were members of the press that wrote sensationalist articles about the performing convict and the man who sung his way out of prison. It wasn't the most flattering depiction of Leadbelly, but it led to quite a bit of recognition, and probably because of this surge of interest, Lomax agreed to become Leadbelly's manager. Through a friend, he managed to get Leadbelly signed to ARC Records, and in January of 1934, they recorded a handful of songs with him that would be the first Leadbelly recordings ever released. They also did a short promotional tour that included interviews, write-ups, and articles about Leadbelly. But unfortunately, this didn't lead to any significant sales. This may have been because the label didn't release any of his folk songs, instead opting to only release the blues songs that he recorded, even though the former would prove to become much more popular in the future. Another reason may have been the way they marketed him. Many articles focused on his crimes, his race, and pretty much anything controversial that they could get their hands on except for his actual music. Maybe if they allowed him to release the music he was better at making, or if they simply marketed him as a musician, his earlier work could have been more popular. But alas, this didn't happen. This meant that he made very little money from his music, but he did make some money from his touring. However, this also came to an abrupt end in March of 1935 when John Lomax decided that he could not work with Leadbelly anymore. The reason was yet again his alcoholism. He decided to give Leadbelly and his new wife, Martha Promise, some money to get home, but he said that he would not pay the full amount he was owed for the shows because Leadbelly would waste it all on alcohol. Instead, he stated that he would pay the money in installments. Leadbelly was not happy about this at all, and he successfully sued Lomax for the amount that he was owed. This lawsuit was also the death of their partnership. It was alleged that things got very tense between the pair, and it was clear that they weren't going to work together ever again. Leadbelly actually did reach out one final time suggesting that they mend their differences, but this didn't lead anywhere. This was unfortunate because although there was some controversies about the way Lomax managed Leadbelly, they made a lot of progress with promotion, shows, and the actual recordings. They may have got there by some unconventional means, but Leadbelly was now more known than ever before, which set him up to become the musician that he's remembered as. It may have been a short period of time, but this chapter is incredibly important in the story of Leadbelly, and his partnership with John Lomax changed everything. In 1939, Leadbelly went to prison for a final time. This is when the previously mentioned Alan Lomax, John's son, decided to help Leadbelly with his legal fees and later his music career. Alan had a show on CBS with director Nicholas Ray called Back Where I Come From. Leadbelly became a regular on this show, which helped propel his name further. New York's folk scene was also on the rise in the early 1940s, and Leadbelly, along with a few others, were at the forefront of this. All of this led him to being signed with Capitol Records in 1944. He moved to California and started to record, and it's safe to say that production-wise, some of the best Leadbelly records ever recorded were done in this time frame. From 1944 to 1948, he recorded songs like Irene, Backwater Blues, and Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Some of his singles were compiled to make the album Midnight Special, which is not only now considered to be an iconic folk album, but it's also very important because it's the last Leadbelly album that was released while he was still alive, because soon after this, he died. So in theory, 1949 was Leadbelly's most successful year. He had his own radio show called Folk Songs of America, which is pretty self-explanatory, and he was continuing to do shows across America. However, his music had left the States and he actually had a fan base in Europe. He is widely considered to be the first American blues artist to establish a presence in Europe, and he took advantage of this by going on a European tour that started in France. Unfortunately, this tour was cut short when he fell ill and had to return home. Shortly after, he was diagnosed with ALS and he was dying. However, before he died, he performed his final ever show at the University of Texas in Austin in honor of John Lomax, who died a year prior. This was a very fitting way to bring things full circle and to say goodbye to the world of music. On the 6th of December 1949, Huddie Ledbetter passed away, and it's safe to say that in his 61 years in this world, Leadbelly changed music forever. There was only 25 days left of the 40s when Leadbelly died, meaning he pretty much lived through all of it. And it's safe to say that the 40s was Leadbelly's most successful decade by far, and it's actually a pretty amazing contrast when you look at the way his life went previously. In the 20s, he was serving a life sentence for literally killing one of his family members. In the 30s, he was in prison again and ended up suing his friend and mentor, and in the 40s, he was a married man with his own radio show, a music career that literally took him to Europe, and he was one of the most recognizable faces of the American folk scene. I'm not saying everything was perfect. Of course, there was a little war that happened in the 40s that I'm sure was stressful for him and everybody around him, but in comparison to his earlier life, Leadbelly had hit his stride and cemented his legacy. His music would live on through the artist he influenced. His impact on folk and blues music was undeniable, but he transcended even that. George Harrison stated, if there was no Leadbelly, there would be no Lonnie Donegan. If there was no Lonnie Donegan, there'd be no Beatles. Therefore, no Leadbelly, no Beatles. As well as this, Bob Dylan cited him as his main influence, and most famously, Leadbelly was Kurt Cobain's favorite artist, which led to Nirvana covering his rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night on MTV Unplugged. This cover was immensely popular, and it introduced a younger audience to the works of Leadbelly. I could talk about his influence in the world of music for hours, but this video is mostly just to serve as a jumping off point. If you want to find out more about the impact that this man made, just go looking for it, and I guarantee that you will find it everywhere.